My brother cut me out of his life for 7 years. He watched my father change the locks on our childhood home and never once said a word to stop it. But everything changed the afternoon he walked through the glass doors of my software company in downtown Austin, Texas, flanked by his wife and his best friend, and sat down in my conference room like he owned the place. He had a manila folder in one hand and a smirk on his face, and he told me I was going to hand over 40% of my company by the end of the business day, or he was going to make one phone call that would burn everything I had built to the ground. What he did not know was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment for 3 years. My name is Sophia, and I am 31 years old. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a software development firm called Groundline Tech. Before I go any further, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. And if you have ever been written off by the people who were supposed to love you most, and then had to watch them come crawling back the moment you became worth something, hit like and subscribe. You are going to want to see how this ends. It was a Tuesday in March when my assistant knocked on my office door and told me my brother was downstairs. I was in the middle of reviewing a contract renewal for one of our largest enterprise clients, the kind of contract that had taken me 18 months of relationship building to close. I remember sitting back in my chair and staring at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. Then I straightened my blazer, saved the document, and told her to send him up. The last time I had seen my brother Marcus was at my parents' house in Round Rock, Texas. I was 22 years old. It was a Thursday evening in October, and the air outside still had that warm edge that Austin carries well into fall. My father had called a family meeting, which in our house meant my father talked and everyone else absorbed the consequences. I had just received a letter from the county probate office informing me that the trust account my grandfather had established in my name at my birth had been closed. Closed. Not drawn down for school expenses. Not transferred. Closed. With a zero balance. And the closure had been authorized 11 months earlier. My grandfather had set aside $92,000 specifically for my education and my future. He was a retired machinist who had lived modestly his entire life and saved methodically because he believed in me in a way that felt uncommon and precious. He told me once when I was 12 years old that he had watched how my mind worked and he wanted to make sure the world didn't slow me down before I got started. When I showed my father the letter, he didn't deny it. He told me the family had needed the money. He told me my brother Marcus had an opportunity to open a barbecue restaurant with his best friend Derek, and the startup costs had been higher than expected, and that this was a family investment, not a theft, and that I would understand when I was older and more mature. My mother sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall. I told my father that what he had described was a crime. I told him I wanted to know how he had accessed a trust account that was in my name alone. He stood up and told me to pack whatever I could carry and get out of his house. My brother Marcus was leaning against the kitchen doorway the entire time, watching. He didn't say a single word. He just pushed off the door frame when it was over and walked back down the hall to his bedroom. I left that night with one bag and $300 in my checking account. For 7 years, I received nothing from them. No birthday call, no holiday text, no checking in to see if I had a roof over my head. I rebuilt myself from the concrete up, working as a junior developer at a small firm in Austin while taking on freelance contracts at night, sleeping on a friend's pull-out couch for 4 months, then renting the cheapest studio I could find and furnishing it in stages with things from garage sales. I was not graceful about it in the beginning. I cried more than I care to admit, but I was relentless, and the same quality that had made my grandfather believe in me made me absolutely refuse to stop building. 6 years ago, I launched Groundline Tech out of that same small apartment with one client and a laptop that had a cracked hinge. 3 years ago, I moved into a proper office suite on the 4th floor of a glass building in downtown Austin. 2 years ago, we signed our first contract with a Fortune 500 client. 14 months ago, we moved into a full floor of a newer, larger building on Congress Avenue. And 11 months ago, quietly and without any announcement, my real estate holding company purchased the commercial complex on South First Street, where my brother's barbecue restaurant had been operating for the last 6 years. Marcus walked into my conference room with his wife, Priya, and his best friend and business partner, Derek. Priya was wearing the kind of effortless weekend outfit that wealthy women in Austin wear on weekdays: linen trousers and a silk top and sandals that probably cost more than my first month's rent in that studio apartment. She looked around my conference room once, slowly, with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the look of someone mentally appraising everything in the room and finding it slightly less impressive than expected. Derek came in behind them. Derek was the kind of man who believed he had excellent instincts and terrible luck, which was a convenient way to avoid examining the relationship between his decisions and his outcomes. He was wearing a blazer over a graphic tee, which in certain Austin tech circles reads as casual confidence and in other circles reads as a man who bought one blazer and considers it a personality. He sat down without being invited to, which told me everything about how he thought this meeting was going to go. Marcus sat directly across from me. He looked like my father around the eyes in a way that had always been true and had always unsettled me. He set the manila folder down on the table with a precise, deliberate motion, like a man who had rehearsed the gesture. He told me that he had been doing a lot of thinking. He told me that the restaurant had been going well, really well, and that he and Derek had big plans for expansion, a second location, a catering operation, a possible food truck presence at festivals across Texas. He said that what they needed to scale was not just capital, but operational expertise, and that it had occurred to him that I had built something impressive over here, and that there was a real opportunity for both sides if we approached it as partners. He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. It was a co-ownership agreement for Groundline Tech. He was asking for 40% of my company. In exchange, he offered to bring Derek on as a strategic consultant, and the restaurant would formally partner with us for corporate catering. I looked at the document. I looked at my brother. I asked him if he wanted water. He said he was fine. I got up and poured myself a glass from the pitcher on the credenza. I took my time with it. When I came back to the table, I asked him what had made him think that a barbecue restaurant's catering operation was equivalent in value to 40% of a software firm. Derek jumped in before Marcus could answer. He told me that I was thinking about it the wrong way. He said that what they were bringing to the table wasn't just the restaurant. It was a network, relationships, community presence. He said that tech companies in Austin were constantly looking for ways to humanize their brand, and that a partnership with a beloved local food institution was actually a form of marketing that money couldn't buy. He said the word synergy, without apparent embarrassment. I let him finish. Then I asked Derek how the second location search was going. He stopped. He looked at Marcus. The specific quality of that look told me the second location search was not going well. I told them I had a few questions before we talked about any partnership terms. I asked Marcus directly when he had last spoken to our parents. He told me he had dinner with them on Sunday. I asked him if they knew he was here. He said it wasn't relevant. I told him I was going to need him to answer the question. His jaw tightened. He said yes, they knew. I nodded. I asked him if any of them had discussed, at any point during that Sunday dinner, the $92,000 that was removed from my grandfather's trust account without my knowledge or consent when I was 22 years old. Priya shifted in her chair. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but I had been watching her since they walked in. Marcus said that was ancient history. He said we were here to talk about the future. I told him I was getting to the future. I just needed to understand the full picture first. He leaned forward and put both forearms on the table. He dropped the careful, measured tone he had been using and let the real one out. He told me that the family had made a mistake. He said it plainly, without much weight behind it, the way you admit a mistake when you are admitting it primarily to move past it. He said things had been handled badly back then, and he was sorry I had been hurt, but that I had clearly done well for myself, and that holding a grudge wasn't going to serve either of us. He picked up the co-ownership agreement and pushed it another inch toward me. He told me that our parents had suggested this as a way to reconnect, to bring the family back together in a meaningful way, and that getting me involved in the restaurant's growth while bringing Marcus and Derek into my company structure would be a way of building something together after years apart. And there it was, the framing that turned a corporate takeover into a reconciliation. The same architecture my mother had always used, attaching a material demand to an emotional promise so that refusing the demand meant refusing the relationship. Derek had gone quiet. He was looking at his phone under the table in the way people do when they are pretending not to. I told Marcus I appreciated his honesty. I told him I had a few things I needed to share with him before we made any decisions, and that I wanted to make sure we were all working from the same information. I pressed the intercom button on the conference room phone and asked my assistant to bring up the Meridian file. She came in a minute later with a thin folder and set it on the table in front of me. I thanked her and waited until she closed the door. I told Marcus that I wanted to ask him about the building on South First Street. I asked him if he was happy with his lease terms over there. He said sure, it was fine. The landlord had always been reasonable. I asked him if he had received the notice that went out in January about the change in property management. He frowned. He said he had gotten something in the mail but hadn't had time to dig into it. I told him he might want to look at that when he got home. Then I opened the Meridian folder and placed a single document on the table between us. It was the recorded deed of sale for the South First Street commercial complex. At the top of the document, in the section designating the purchasing entity, was the name of my holding company. Below that, in the section designating the sole managing member of that entity, was my full legal name. Marcus stared at it. He picked it up. He read it twice. I watched him understand it, and then I watched him not want to have understood it. He said there must be a mistake. I told him there wasn't. I told him I had purchased the complex 11 months ago in an all-cash transaction. I told him I was his landlord. Derek looked up from his phone. Priya said nothing, but she set down the glass of water she had just picked up. Marcus said my name once, not as a greeting or a question, just as a sound he needed to make while his mind caught up with the information in his hands. Then he put the deed down and straightened up and made the decision to be angry about it. He told me I had known this when he walked in. He told me this whole meeting had been a setup. He told me I had let him sit here and make his pitch, knowing the entire time that I was already holding the lease to his business. I told him I had let him say what he came to say. I told him that seemed fair, given that I had not been given the courtesy of a conversation before my inheritance was liquidated. He pushed back from the table. I told him to sit down. I told him we weren't finished. He stayed standing. He told me I thought I was so clever. He said that whatever I was planning to do with the lease, I needed to understand that he had a business there, a real business, with employees and regular customers, and that whatever point I was trying to make, punishing the people who worked for him to get back at him was beneath me. I told him I wasn't planning to punish anyone. Derek had stood up too now. He was doing the thing men do when they feel a situation slipping out of their control, filling space with their physical presence as a substitute for having something useful to say. He told me that if I was threatening to modify the lease terms, I should know that he had a close personal relationship with several commercial real estate attorneys in Austin, and he would not hesitate to pursue legal remedies. I asked Derek how the Series A conversation with his investors had gone last quarter. He stopped. I told him I read the Austin Business Journal every morning, with my coffee, and that I had read with some interest about the bridge loan his catering side venture had taken on at a 14% interest rate to cover a payroll shortfall, and that the original investor group for his food truck expansion had withdrawn their commitment in January. I told him I found it admirable that he was still thinking about legal fees at a moment like this. He sat back down. Marcus looked at his wife. Priya was looking at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, somewhere between wariness and something that might have been reluctant respect. She had not said a single word since they sat down. Marcus said that whatever I thought I knew about Derek's finances, this wasn't about Derek. He said this was between family. I told him I agreed completely. I told him that was exactly why I wanted to talk about the other property. I reached back into the Meridian folder and placed a second document on the table. This one was the recorded deed for a small commercial strip on the eastern edge of Round Rock, about 4 blocks from the house where I grew up. My parents had operated their dry cleaning business out of a unit in that strip for 12 years. It was the backbone of their income, the thing my father pointed to when he talked about the life he had built, the thing that funded the country club membership they'd had for 9 years before they quietly let it lapse 2 years ago when the revenues started declining. Marcus picked up the second deed. He looked at it for a long time. I told him I had purchased that property 14 months ago. I told him my parents were currently in the 3rd month of a month-to-month lease agreement, having declined to renew their long-term contract when it expired in December, which I suspected was because they could not absorb the standard annual rate increase. Marcus set the paper down very carefully. I told him I wanted to say something clearly, and I wanted him to hear it without interrupting me. He didn't speak. I told him that for 7 years, I had not asked anyone in our family for a single thing. I had not called to ask for money when I was sleeping on a couch. I had not called to ask for a reference or a connection or a kind word. I had rebuilt everything from nothing without their help or their presence or their acknowledgement that I existed. And during that same 7 years, not one person in our family had picked up a phone to ask if I was alive. I told him I was not angry about that anymore. I had been, for a long time, and then I had done the work to stop being angry and to start being strategic, and those were two very different things. Marcus's voice when he finally spoke was quieter than it had been. He asked me what I wanted. I told him what I did not want first. I told him I did not want 40% of my own company handed to the brother who watched my father put me out with a bag of clothes and said nothing. I did not want a strategic consulting arrangement with a man whose business was quietly collapsing. And I did not want a reconciliation that was structured around what I could provide financially to people who had decided I was disposable until I became an asset. Derek made a sound. It was the beginning of an objection. I looked at him and he swallowed it. I told Marcus that I did want one thing. I told him I wanted him to sit in this conference room and tell me, out loud, what happened to $92,000. The room was completely quiet. Marcus looked at the table. When he looked up, his face had changed. The negotiating composure was gone. He looked younger somehow, and more tired, in a way that made him look more like the brother I had actually grown up with, and less like the version of himself he had walked in presenting. He said that Dad had told him the money was going to be reinvested through a family account, and that Marcus would be able to use part of it to cover the restaurant launch, and that Sophia would get a portion back when the restaurant started turning a profit. I asked him if he had believed that. He looked at the window. I told him I already knew the answer. He said he was 25, and he had wanted the restaurant, and he had told himself it wasn't his decision to make. He said he knew that wasn't good enough. I told him he was right that it wasn't good enough. I told him it also wasn't the reason I had built a real estate portfolio. I told him I had built it because I was good at identifying undervalued assets in markets I understood, and because my grandfather had taught me to think about money as infrastructure rather than comfort, and because it had genuinely nothing to do with them until the morning my property manager flagged a tenant renewal issue at a South First Street commercial property, and I looked up the business name and recognized it. I told him that at that point, I had a choice to make. I could divest the property or I could hold it. I held it. I held both of them. Marcus asked me what I was going to do. I told him I was going to do exactly what I had done with every other commercial tenant in my portfolio. I was going to extend a standard lease renewal at a market-adjusted rate, and his restaurant and our parents' dry cleaning business were both welcome to operate on those terms for as long as they chose. I told him I was not his enemy. I told him I also was not a remedy for the consequences of decisions made by adults who knew what they were doing. Derek stood up again. He said this was not why they had come here. He said they had come here in good faith to propose a legitimate partnership, and this had turned into something else entirely. He said that if Sophia was going to use her position as a landlord to retaliate against family members, he was going to make sure people in the Austin business community knew about it, and that her company's reputation would take a hit she couldn't afford right now. I asked Derek if he wanted to tell me more about that. He said he meant it. I reached into the folder one last time. I placed a single printed page in front of him. It was a screenshot from a local business forum, where, approximately 8 months ago, a username I had traced back to an IP address registered to Derek's home network had posted a review of a competitor's catering business, accusing them of health code violations that had never occurred, which I knew because I had called the Austin Public Health Department and confirmed. The competitor had since gone out of business. Derek stared at the page. His face did something complicated. I told him that I genuinely hoped his reputation in the Austin business community was sturdy enough to hold up under the attention that a conversation about this forum post might generate. I told him I was not interested in having that conversation, but that I was interested in finishing this meeting without any further discussion of what I could or could not afford. He did not say another word for the remainder of the time they were in my office. Priya had been sitting very still for the last 15 minutes. She asked me, directly and without any warmth but also without hostility, whether there was any version of this conversation that ended with a functional relationship between Marcus and me. I told her that was a real question, and I appreciated her asking it directly. I told her that I didn't know. I told her that I had not made decisions about my portfolio as a way of manufacturing leverage against my family. I had made them as a business person. And now that they happened to be connected, I was not going to pretend they weren't. I told her that if Marcus wanted to have a conversation about what had happened 7 years ago, not a reconciliation with business terms attached, but an actual conversation, I was not opposed to that. I told her I was not holding a door open forever, but I was not locking it either. She nodded. She looked at Marcus. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he picked up the co-ownership agreement, the one he had brought in and slid toward me with such careful deliberateness, and he folded it twice and put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't throw it away in front of me. I noticed that. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I noticed it. He stood up. He told me he owed me a real conversation. He said he had owed me one for a long time, and that he had found reasons not to have it, and he was aware of how that looked. I told him I knew. He said he would be in touch. I told him I would be here. They left. I stayed in the conference room for a few minutes after the elevator closed. Outside the window, downtown Austin was doing what it does on a March afternoon, moving fast and bright in that particular Texas way, where the sky feels wider than it has any right to be. I had not cried. I had not raised my voice. I had not said anything I did not mean. My assistant knocked and asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine and that I was going back to the Delaney contract and could she hold my calls for 30 minutes. 6 weeks later, I was at my desk at 6 in the morning, which is where I am most mornings, when my phone rang. It was my mother. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told her yes. I told her to come to the office, not a coffee shop, and that she should come alone. She arrived at 9. She was wearing a blazer and her hair was done, which meant she had prepared herself for this the way she prepared for things that mattered to her. She looked older than I remembered. Not in a sad way, just in the way that 7 years looks on a person's face when you haven't been watching it happen gradually. She sat across from me in the same conference room. I got her water and I got myself coffee and I sat down. She said she didn't know where to start. I told her to start with the trust account. She told me. It took about 20 minutes. My father had authorized the access through a power of attorney document that should never have applied to an account held in my name alone. The attorney involved had since lost his license, for reasons unrelated to our family but not unrelated to his broader practices. The money had gone directly to the restaurant build-out. Marcus had known the source. She had known the source. She had told my father it was wrong and he had told her the family came first, and she had not pushed back the way she should have, the way she now understood she should have, the way she had spent years not letting herself fully look at, because looking at it fully meant looking at what she had allowed to happen to her daughter. She was not crying. She was speaking in a flat, careful voice that told me she had rehearsed this, that she had possibly rehearsed it for years, and that the rehearsal was the only reason she could get through it without coming apart. When she finished, I didn't say anything for a while. Then I asked her one question. I asked her, on the night my father told me to leave, what had stopped her from opening the door after I walked down the driveway. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her hands. She told me she had been afraid of what he would do if she went against him. She told me she had been telling herself for so long that keeping the peace protected everyone that she had forgotten what it actually cost. She told me that watching me build what I had built without any of them had been the most clarifying and the most painful thing she had witnessed in her adult life, and that she understood if that was too late to matter. I told her it wasn't too late to matter. I told her it didn't change what had happened, but it mattered. We talked for another hour. Not about the properties or the business or the lease renewals, about other things, older things. My grandfather. The way he used to sit with me at the kitchen table and explain how savings accounts worked when I was 9 years old. The things she remembered about who I was before everything went wrong. When she left, I sat by the window for a while. The city was fully awake now. I could see the top floor of the building on Congress Avenue that I had signed papers on 14 months ago, the one where my office was, the one I owned. I could see the shape of the skyline that I had spent years learning to navigate and then to be part of. There is something people don't tell you about building a life from scratch after someone strips it from you. They tell you it's hard, which is true. They tell you it takes time, which is also true. What they don't tell you is that at some point the building becomes its own reason, not because you are trying to prove something to the people who doubted you, though that's in there at the beginning, but because you discover that you are genuinely good at this, that you have a mind that is suited for exactly this kind of problem, and that the difficulty of the path made you better at walking it than you ever would have been on an easier road. My grandfather knew that about me when I was 12 years old, before I knew it about myself. Last month, I finalized a partnership with a nonprofit organization called Open Threshold, which provides transitional housing and legal advocacy for young adults who have been displaced from their family homes. I donated the top unit of the South First Street complex to them on a 5-year rent-free agreement. The unit had been vacant since my acquisition. It had a good light in the mornings, which I had noticed when I first toured the property, and I thought good light mattered for people who were in the process of rebuilding. The dry cleaning business renewed its lease at the adjusted market rate. My father has not called me. I expect he won't for some time, and I am at peace with that timetable. Marcus and I have had 2 conversations since the conference room. They were not easy conversations. They were the kind where a great deal of what is said is sitting underneath what is actually said, and where moving even a small distance takes more effort than it should, because the distance you are covering is not measured in words but in years. But we are having them. That is not nothing. I am telling you this because I know someone watching this right now is standing in a version of the driveway I stood in at 22 years old. Someone is holding a bag with what they managed to grab, and the door is closed behind them, and the world in front of them looks enormous and indifferent, and the people who were supposed to protect them just proved they wouldn't. You are not what they decided you were. You are not the role they cast you in, so the rest of the story made sense for them. The version of you they needed you to be was small and dependent and grateful for whatever they offered, and you were always going to be too much for that role. That is not a flaw. That is the thing that is going to save you. Build something they cannot take back. Build it slowly and carefully and without announcing it, and let the work be the answer. Not because they deserve the drama of watching you succeed, but because you deserve the life you are going to build when you stop waiting for their permission. And when they show up at your door after 7 years with a folder and a business proposition dressed up as family love, you will know exactly what to do. If you have ever had to walk away from a family that treated your absence as the problem instead of their behavior, leave a comment. I read every single one. Hit subscribe and come back for more stories about people who built something real from what was left after everything else was taken. I will see you in the next one.